Hey guys, welcome back to the Daily Departure. I am Noelle, a Chicago-based flight attendant, and I fly for a mainline US carrier. Today in my series, So You Want to Be a Flight Attendant, we are going to be talking about the difference between regional and mainline carriers. For my career as a flight attendant, I have only ever worked for a mainline carrier, but I have seen firsthand the lifestyle that comes with a regional carrier as well. I've been wanting to make this video for a really long time, just to share my knowledge of the industry with you guys. I also think this information is really important for those of you that are going to be applying to different airlines. I think it's really helpful information to have when choosing which airlines to apply for or which offers to accept. So 5 years ago when I started applying to be a flight attendant, I actually had no idea that there was a difference between these different carriers. I didn't know the concept of mainline regional carriers even existed. So about 5 years ago when I was applying to carriers, I literally applied to 4 different airlines. 3 were mainline carriers and 1 was a regional carrier. And first of all, I wanted to say, if you are applying to the airlines, you do not need to start at a regional carrier. You can literally get hired at any airline. Oftentimes it's actually preferred that you don't have previous airline experience as well. A lot of people will ask me, so do you suggest that I go to a regional carrier first to understand the industry, to understand the job? No, absolutely not. You can definitely go to a mainline carrier first. You do not need to go to a regional first. But I just wanted to bring that up because I do get asked a lot, do I need to go to a regional carrier first? No, if you're not a pilot, you do not need to go to a regional carrier first. But that pilot stuff is its own subject that I won't even get into today. So I just grabbed the definition of regional airlines off the internet, and I'm going to read it for you guys because I'm not even going to try to sum it up in my own words. But regional airlines are airlines that operate regional aircraft to provide passenger air service to communities without sufficient demand to attract mainline service. A number of regional airlines, also previously known as commuter airlines. And then on the other side of that, a mainline airline. Mainline flight is a flight operated by an airline's main operating unit rather than by regional alliances, regional code shares, regional subsidiaries, and wholly owned subsidiaries offering low-cost operations. So I'm just going to go through a list of airlines that you may have heard of before and tell you which category these fall under. So some of the main regional carriers that you may have heard of before are SkyWest, GoJets, Commutair, Endeavor, Air Wisconsin, Envoy, Piedmont, PSA, Mesa, and Republic. The mainline carriers in the US are American, Delta, and United, and depending on who you ask, Southwest might fit under that category as well. And then also low-cost carriers include Spirit, JetBlue, Frontier, and like I said, depending on who you ask, Southwest I feel like sometimes falls under the category of low-cost carrier and also mainline carrier, but again, depends on who you ask. Oh, and also 2 more low-budget carriers that I oftentimes forget about is also Sun Country and Allegiant. Those are 2 more. So you might not be familiar with any regional carriers because typically regional carriers operate under a mainline carrier's name. So if you are flying on American Airlines, you might be flying on an aircraft operated by PSA, operated by Mesa, operated by Piedmont. It really can be any of those regional carriers I listed off. It just depends on who they're under contract with. So basically these mainline carriers come in and they contract with regional carriers and they say, hey, will you do our regional flying? And obviously if they make a deal, then that carrier does regional flying for them. Just to break that down a little bit more, for example, SkyWest is a carrier that does flying for Delta, they do flying for American, they do flying for United. It just depends on who they have contracts with. Then there's some airlines like Air Wisconsin, for example, that only does contracted flying with United. So anytime you're on an Air Wisconsin flight, you probably purchased a ticket from United. And then unique to American Airlines, they have 3 regional carriers that are wholly owned. That is Piedmont, PSA, and Envoy. Honestly, like the biggest difference between that and the other regionals is that, again, they only fly for American, but the difference with working for one of those regionals versus others is that you have the same exact flight benefits that mainline flight crews and employees have. If you worked for a company like SkyWest or Air Wisconsin, you're going to have flight benefits from those mainline carriers, but your flight benefits are going to be like a lower status when it comes to being on the standby list. So that is one of the benefits maybe to working for a company that's wholly owned by a mainline versus one that's just purely contracted out. I hope that made sense to you guys. It's a very interesting part of the industry because you might be flying for Mesa, but if you're buying a ticket, you're not buying a ticket from Mesa Airlines, you're buying a ticket from like American Airlines or something like that. And I feel like that's one of the biggest differences between like regionals versus low-cost carriers is, again, if you're flying on a low-cost carrier like Frontier or something, you are flying on a plane operated by Frontier, and it's also a ticket bought through Frontier. So I would say one of the biggest differences between mainline and regional has to do with pay. Working for a regional carrier, typically the pay is less than that of a mainline carrier. Sometimes it's a little bit less, sometimes it can be as much as like half as much starting out. Most carriers, when you progress in your career and gain more seniority, every year you get a pay raise. That can vary as well, but usually every year you get a pay raise. At a lot of the airlines, you eventually will start making more money, but starting off there is kind of a difference between pay. Some mainline carriers start at around like $30 an hour, and some regional carriers start at like $16, $17, $18 an hour. So you can already see a difference there, why it might be more beneficial to fly for a mainline carrier than a regional carrier. Another big difference between regional carriers versus mainline carriers has to do along the lines of like the trip builds and the routes. So as it mentioned in the definition, regional carriers usually are carriers are like feeders to larger cities. I'm going to provide an example here. American Airlines and United both have bases in Chicago. Out of Chicago on American and United, you can fly to major cities like LA, to Dallas, to Miami. You can fly to other countries like in Europe or in Asia, and those are going to be operated under American Airlines. But some of the routes that are operated by regional carriers would be like maybe Appleton, Wisconsin to Chicago, or Grand Rapids, Michigan to Chicago, which just typically are smaller cities, much shorter routes, and those routes typically like that are operated by regional carriers. It's not to say that mainline carriers don't also fly short routes occasionally. I mean, like Chicago to Indianapolis is operated by both mainline and regional, and that's a very short flight. But typically when you think of regional carriers, you think of them operating those like really shorter flights, and they're the carriers that fly into those like smaller regional type airports. And again, this is just a really like general explanation of the type of routes that regionals fly, because sometimes there are even routes that regionals fly that are just as long as mainline routes. Like it really varies. For example, another one is like Chicago to New York's LaGuardia Airport, a very big route. Those flights are very popular. Those are operated by both regional and mainline carriers. So it really can depend, but a lot of the times, oftentimes, those smaller regional airports and those shorter routes are flown by regional carriers. Okay, now what does that mean in terms of trip builds? For me, working for a mainline carrier, typically a day at work, I work from anywhere from 1 to 3 legs a day. Occasionally you'll have trips that are 4 legs a day. It depends on maybe also like where you're based. But typically out of Chicago, we don't have 4-leg days that often. Charlotte's a base for us that like a lot of the time has like 4-leg days more often. But I think I've only ever flown 4 legs in a day like once in my almost 5 years of being a flight attendant. Where at regionals, because you're operating a lot more of those shorter flights, because they're so short, you have more time in your duty day to operate many more flights. So at regional carriers, I mean, you're definitely going to have days where you're flying 1 or 2 legs, but you also will have probably more days where you're flying 4 or even 5-leg days. You might even fly 6 legs in one day as well. But just like mainline versus regional, trip build wise, regionals fly a lot more legs in a trip than mainline flight attendants usually fly. And again, if you're not familiar with flight attendant schedules and how our schedules are built, this might not make sense to you, but I think the biggest downside for me personally with flying more legs is that every time you have a leg that you're flying, you have 30 minutes of boarding, which you're not paid for. So for me personally, I just find it more beneficial to fly less legs in a day, because a lot less time you're like actually working and not getting paid, versus if you're flying 6 legs a day, look at all that time that you're working and not getting paid. That's one of the downsides of maybe working for a regional, is you're just going to have a lot more legs in one day. You might have the same duty period, you might both be working 12-hour days, but one person is flying 4 legs and the other person is flying only 2 legs. I feel like a misconception between mainline and regional carriers is that regionals don't fly international, which is completely false. The difference is that mainline typically flies like long haul international, where regionals, they fly international, but it's usually like Canada or Mexico, like anywhere like Central America or sometimes the Caribbean. And then mainline carriers are the ones that are also flying some of those smaller routes to Canada and Mexico, Caribbean, all that stuff, but they also fly long haul international. So that is like Europe, South America, Africa, Asia. A lot of the time those flights are operated by mainline carriers because those are what we call long haul internationals. So definitely if you want to fly international, you can still work for a regional and get cool layovers in international cities. Another difference between mainline and regional carriers is the type of aircraft that they fly. Typically regional carriers fly ERJs and CRJs. Those aircrafts will typically have about 50 to 75 passengers, give or take. Basically, the FAA requires per 50 passengers, there is 1 flight attendant. So typically regional carriers, if they have 50 seats, there's 1 flight attendant, and if they have anything above that, there's 2 flight attendants. And I'm pretty sure there's something within like the scope of the contract that allows regionals to have so many planes, and they can't have more than like X amount of seats. So that's typically why regionals have smaller aircrafts with less seats. And I'm pretty sure most regionals only have 1 or 2 flight attendants on an aircraft at a time. And then at mainline carriers, you fly a lot of larger aircrafts. Typically mainline carriers will fly Airbus, like a 319, 321, Airbus 320, Airbus 220, and then they also fly like a Boeing 737, a 777, 787, 76, 75, all those numbers. Most mainline carriers typically have like 3 to 10 flight attendants, give or take. It depends on which aircraft you're on, if you're on like a narrow body or a wide body aircraft, or if you're flying domestic or international. Typically the flight attendant count is around there. I know for my airline, the smallest plane we have is the Airbus 319, and that has 3 flight attendants. Most of my trips are on the 73 or the Airbus, and we have 4 flight attendants on those, Airbus 321 and 320, but typically we have 4 flight attendants. And then if you're on a wide body aircraft, domestically, usually you'll have about 8 flight attendants. And again, that has to do with the FAA's requirements of how many flight attendants you have per X amount of passengers. So sometimes that's incentive for some people to work for a mainline or a regional carrier. Sometimes people prefer flying as the only flight attendant on the aircraft, and some people prefer to fly an aircraft with many more flight attendants. It's all personal preference and what you'd prefer to fly. Now, another thing to add, which doesn't necessarily have to do with like regional versus mainline, I guess it just has to do with airlines in general, the idea of like how your reserve works. I feel like a lot of regional carriers are straight reserve, and then you hold lines after that. I have a whole different video that I filmed explaining that, so you can check that out if you want more information. But definitely I feel like a lot more regionals have straight reserve. Some mainline carriers also have straight reserve, so it's not necessarily just exclusive to regional carriers. But I feel like from what I've heard is at regional carriers, your seniority can shift quite a bit more. So you might be able to hold a line a lot sooner and get out of straight reserve a lot sooner at a regional carrier versus at a mainline carrier. So I think that's one of the big benefits of working for a regional that some people take into account when applying and getting hired. Also, something unique to some regional carriers have a lot different base options than mainline carriers. I feel like even a lot of regional carriers have bases in some of those like smaller US cities. And also the seniority can shift around a lot too, so you might be able to be based at a city of your preference a lot sooner at a regional carrier than at a mainline carrier. Within regionals and within mainline carriers, all of them are very different. Every company has their own contract and work rules. in which you will work under. If one regional is good for you, another one might not be, and same with mainline carriers. If one mainline carrier really works for your lifestyle, another one might not match it very well. And in my experience, both with myself working for a mainline carrier and knowing people that work for regional carriers, again, it depends on which regional carrier you work for. I've definitely seen regional lifestyle be, I feel like, a lot harder. For me at mainline, like if I'm on reserve and I finish a trip, like I just go home and I don't worry about it. Some regional carriers, they require you to like call in and get released, and sometimes crew scheduling won't release you. They'll actually like reassign you and make you fly another day or another trip or a couple more legs. So I feel like lifestyle wise too, there is definitely a difference between the two, but again, there are definitely pros and cons to both of them. And as I mentioned earlier, the trip builds are very different for regionals versus mainline carriers. Also the layovers can be very different, but again, it depends on which regional you work for, what type of routes that the regional offers, and where they make their layovers. There are a lot of differences between working for a mainline or a regional carrier, but again, you have to find what is the best for you and your lifestyle. The one thing I wanted to add in about low-cost carriers, like I said, I'm not as familiar with low-cost carriers as I am with regionals and mainline carriers, but I would almost say low-cost carriers are a lot more similar to mainline carriers, but a lot of them don't have like those long-haul internationals like mainline has, but they do fly in and out of a lot of those major cities and have layovers in a lot of those major cities, and I would say the pay is also a little bit better at some low-cost carriers. And a lot of low-cost carriers will fly like 737s and 321s and aircraft like that, where you're gonna have like 3 or 4 flight attendants. So I know some people prefer to be on aircrafts like that versus having an aircraft that's like 1 or 2 flight attendants. I hope this information was helpful to you guys, especially if you are exploring the opportunity of being a flight attendant and you want more information about the industry. If you guys have any more questions in regards to regionals, low-cost carriers, or mainline carriers, feel free to comment down below or DM me and I will try to answer those questions. If you like this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, and I will see you guys next time on The Daily Departure.